presentation will be about race and education and a severe problem in this country, which is...
So the problem we have in our country is there's currently a severe divide in the quality of education received by students on the grounds of race.
So first we're going to take a look at the historical challenges, especially in Chicago, with a case study of racial divide and the education caused, and the divide in education caused by discrimination.
Yes, and the story of Chicago mirrors many other cities such as Baltimore and Philadelphia. So the Chicago story starts with it starts with slavery, but also with Jim Crow, the Great Migration, and segregation. So historically, blacks were enslaved in this country and were racially segregated from white populations. From 1877 to 1965, there were the Jim Crow laws, which partially inspired the Great Migration, which led many blacks from the South to move up into the North, into small, tight communities in the North. And in the North, conditions weren't much better, and they faced many problems, which other blacks in other areas also, other cities, also experienced, such as
Redlining. And so with redlining, what this means is the definition of the illegal practice of refusing to offer credit or insurance in a particular community on a discriminatory basis and as because of a race or ethnicity of the residents. And what this ended up happening was kind of like segregating and splitting people up based on the color of their skin. So if people wanted a loan to move somewhere, the banks or insurance companies would not provide loans to people of color versus majority, which would be Caucasian, and in that case they'd be able to be able to move to better education location and be able to have a better life in the sense of being able to climax or capitalize on the idea of being able to get a better house for a better value.
And partially the way this worked was that, so there was the Great Depression, and during that time, FDR wanted to make sure that the housing market didn't collapse too much. So what he did is he set up an organization, and what they did is they divided areas that were already either white, black, or wealthy or poor, and put these areas into really concrete categories. And so there were 4 classes, A, B, C, and D. In the A category, in the A class, it was really easy for people to get loans from the banks. It was very desirable property. The houses appreciated in value. They were more expensive houses, so schools received more property tax. And those areas tend to be primarily white. While in the D districts, they were deemed hazardous and unsafe, and they were really dilapidated housing conditions. There was no really investment into the area. People didn't want to move in that area, and the effect of that is that the schools in those areas suffered horribly, and the schools still are primarily black schools.
So one of the other ways that African Americans were discriminated against in law was through these housing covenants that basically did not allow anyone who was not white to live within a certain residential section unless that person was a servant to a white family. So this was kind of perpetuating the Jim Crow era laws. Yeah,
So even if these people in the D areas had the means to progress and move up economically into the B or the A areas, they legally were not allowed to. They were segregated from the primarily white communities. And another form of discrimination that led to a divide in housing was the GI Bill. So World War II, both black and white soldiers in the millions went to fight, and when they got back, they received the GI Bill, which ensured things such as cash stipends for schooling, job skills training, low interest mortgages, unemployment benefits, and low interest loans. And the problem is that African Americans did not have access to the benefits from the GI Bill because, one, banks that were controlled by the white leaders denied them mortgages at all, denied them loans. So regardless of whether or not it was low or high interest, they couldn't get loans. And if they could get loans, it was almost always very high interest. Another thing were cash stipends for schooling. African Americans could not get into the white schools. The University of Pennsylvania, the most racially egalitarian university in 1946, had only 40 black students out of 9,000 students. Now they couldn't get into the white schools because the white admissions committees denied them, and they also couldn't get into the black schools because they were overpopulated. And so many of these veterans did not benefit from that either. They also couldn't get job training because the people who were training for jobs were primarily white, considered white applicants much more heavily than the black applicants. And so essentially the GI Bill, these veterans didn't get the benefit from it at all, which further added to the lack of intergenerational wealth, the ability to generate intergenerational wealth or upward mobility in addition to these housing conditions. Now, this issue was recognized. So less than a week after Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated, the House of Representatives passed the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which prohibited the sort of discrimination experienced by the blacks. However, the problem is that in cities like Chicago, Baltimore, or Philly, it actually did not help because it was relatively unenforceable. The white homeowners, the banks, the realtors, the people who had access to the A-class, B-class houses still were not very welcoming of the efforts to desegregate.
So to try to help with the discrimination for housing, Chicago started the projects in 1937, and for 20 years between 1940 and 1960, this was actually pretty decent public housing. But once the 1960s began, this housing was just as dangerous, if not more dangerous, due to all of the drugs, violence, and gangs that then moved into this neighborhood.
And so just like the Fair Housing Act, it was an attempt to address some of these issues, but really did not lead to significant positive results.
So due to all the low-income housing, it affected the Chicago public schooling a lot. So based off these graphs, the first graph shows the percentage of Chicago families that are considered low income, and that's 52%. So over half the population of Chicago. And the second graph is the percentage of Chicago public school students that are low income, and that's 85%. And this had a huge impact because of all the housing having very low property values that affected a lot of the funding for these public schools. And for all this data, the low income is considered if a student can qualify for the free lunch program.
And an important note, the majority of students in the Chicago public schools, like the video said, are black and Latino. So 85% of those students are black.
So now we're going to watch a video about the current problems of education in Chicago.
In part 1 of the series, we learned about how the city of Chicago got to be so segregated. In part 2, we'll look at what segregation does to a city, and in particular to one of its most vulnerable populations, its students.
The Chicago public school system is horrible, to say the least.
I had gone through 13 years of schooling, and I had never read a book.
When I went off to college, I wasn't prepared at all. Our communities that need the resources the most to get students to college are the ones that lack it.
Driving through the streets of Chicago, my hometown, it's not hard to see the difference from one neighborhood to the next. Take Halsted Street, the backbone of Chicago. You can start on Halsted in Lincoln Park on the north side, where rows of beautiful townhouses line the street. But travel south 10 miles until you reach 63rd Street, just around the corner from Harold's Chicken, and suddenly you're in a very different part of town. Nowhere is the difference more startling than in Chicago's public schools.
So this right here used to be an elementary school. This is one of the 50 schools that ROM shut down. The community suffers. We have the property value suffers. You got boarded up houses, vacant lots. I mean, this community is filled with no hope.
There's something about life in a segregated city that produces generations of children who don't get anywhere near the potential to realizing the potential they had when they were born.
Troy was removed from his position as a school principal last year after criticizing Mayor Rahm Emanuel's mismanagement of the school system. In Chicago, most students are black and Latino, and only 9% are white. About 86% of all of its students are low income.
They came to us from unstable housing conditions. They came to us homeless. They came to us hungry. They came to us with the trauma that comes from being in a neighborhood where violence is sometimes a regular occurrence.
This trauma that so many of the students have didn't appear out of nowhere. It came from decades of segregation policies that have kept people of color separate, in low-income neighborhoods without access to basic resources like quality healthcare and economic opportunity.
What was it about my life in Bronzeville? What was it about my life in Back of the Yards? What was it about my life in all-black Inglewood that led me to have such a low assessment of myself?
Chicago Public Schools, or CPS, has been strapped for cash for years, and long argued that despite having 20% of the students in the state of Illinois, it only receives 15% of the state's education funding.
At my elementary school, the walls were definitely peeling. The books were breaking apart. We rarely got new books, like new reading books for the students, unless someone donated them.
When I moved here, I thought, what in the hell is this? Why don't we have this? Why don't we have that? And I would get stuff like, we used to have that, we used to have this. And I think there was just no real broad plan around, like, how do you support small, high-needs high schools?
Tilden lost nearly $200,000 last year because of enrollment declines and budget cuts. And after a school improvement grant expired, Swinney had to lay off his clinical staff who were helping his most troubled students.
Once we lost those people, we felt it. You feel it when I can't say, so what's going on? Okay, let me go and connect you with Miss So-and-so. It's like, no, Maurice, you're the clinician right now. Let's have a seat and sit down. Let's figure this out.
In 2015, Mayor Rahm Emanuel announced $200 million in school budget cuts and 1,300 staff layoffs across the district. I was impressed by Principal Swinney's ability to persevere in spite of all of these odds.
When you look at that, the majority of the kids in the Chicago public school system is black. It's the urban communities, are minorities. And then you say, how come all the politicians and everybody with money send their kids to private schools? Because they know that the public school system is horrible.
For parents, knowing how to choose a school is really complicated. There are charter schools, selective enrollment schools, magnet schools, and then your regular neighborhood schools.
I think parents make the best choice that they can. I think parents want their students to be successful. Parents are trying to give their children the best opportunity.
But this concept of school choice is criticized as detrimental to communities. As parents choose to send their kids sometimes hours away to charter or selective enrollment schools, for example, there is little confidence left in the local neighborhood schools. And because funding is directly tied to enrollment, fewer students means less funding.
I'm worried because I know for myself as a first-generation college student, I know the difference that a quality education has on kids. I just need for her to be at a place that is going to equip her with the academic and social-emotional skills that she needs to be able to be successful.
Despite the budget cuts, since 2010, CPS has spent hundreds of millions on the construction of new schools and expensive additions, but mostly to schools that serve white middle-class students. And many have blamed those in power for making decisions not in the interests of local students, but in order to profit off the school system. In April, the former head of CPS was sentenced to 4.5 years in prison for corruption.
And we live in a system that will look at the education of that child and sabotage it on purpose, will intentionally not give that child what you'll give another child who happens to be white, right? Both babies beautiful, both babies deserve it.
When it was time for Jitu to choose a school for his own son, he struggled with the choice of sending him to a lower resource neighborhood school.
My son is not as beautiful as any other child. He's not as intelligent, as brilliant. When I look at him, stars go off in my head.
In 1971, the Supreme Court did attempt to desegregate U.S. public schools with busing, and for the most part, it worked. Minority students fared better at integrated schools, and by 1988, integration had reached its peak. But for many reasons, the busing efforts stopped, and today, public schools across the nation, including in Chicago, are almost as segregated as they were in the 1960s.
When you don't invest in young people, you get unemployment, you get crime, you get violence. And so you get blighted communities when you don't invest in the people from those communities.
A good education is supposed to be a chance at upward mobility, some hope for the future. But in Chicago's public schools, that's just not happening.
People have to look at the inequity in Chicago, the segregation in Chicago. That doesn't mean who gets to sit next to who. It means access to resources and opportunity. The segregation in Chicago is the evil. The intentional sabotage of a baby's education is the evil. And I ask people to think, what could be more evil than that?
With more than 600 schools, the Chicago public school system is the 4th largest in the nation. So that's affecting a lot of kids, 400,000 actually. In the next video, I'll spend a day on the city's south side speaking to a guy who has a different vision for solving the city's crime problems.
Yep.
So now this takes us to the current challenges, and we're going to address the challenges with the city of Chicago on a more current base level.
So some of the issues that were previously discussed was the systematic and implicit racism that stemmed from slavery and Jim Crow laws into modern day. So these the past housing acts entrenched African Americans into these low income and low property value areas, which perpetuates this practice of redlining. It doesn't allow these families to access the social mobility that they should be able to.
This is in spite of the efforts taken so far with the Chicago Housing Authority and with the Fair Housing Act. There's still segregation in these areas. Another current issue is the neoliberalist, aka school choice movement. Advocates of this movement would support the state giving parents vouchers equivalent to the amount of money that they've paid in taxes to send their kids to whatever school they would like to send them to. The problem with this is that it's already happening in certain areas like Detroit, and in these areas there are problems such as extreme defunding and closing of public schools because parents have taken their kids out of the public schools, which are pretty terrible, and sent them to charter and private schools, which leads to schools closing down, leading parents who are already economically disadvantaged to have less and worse options than when before these programs started to be implemented. Another thing is that because schools are shutting down, there's education deserts where parents and students who live in certain areas don't have access to schools and have to travel sometimes miles and hours just to get to school, and a school that is not of the highest quality. And then to add insult to injury, there's been no significant increase in student performance in Chicago as a result of the school choice movement. And so essentially what this does is it further segregates schools and further cements the inequality. White parents who have more property value, are paying more tax money, have more options to send their kids to better school as well. The parents without money, the black parents, have much less options and have to send their kids to public schools.
So then this brings us to the future issues and the type of things we can anticipate to come. And so with this, I drawed a thesis statement from a book called Racism Without Racists, and it's by Eduardo Bonilla Silva. And what he stated was that thus whites enunciated positions that safeguard their racial interests without sounding racist. And what this kind of leads us to is to a future where like the institution itself and people don't really act as if they're racist, but it's the actual actions that they do might still hold people back of minorities. And in this issue, it could cause people to have color blindness, as they state. And with this, kind of whites can express resentment toward minorities and criticize their morality, values, and work ethic, and even claim to be victims of reverse racism. And I've heard this myself, and the idea of getting into college and people stating how minorities have the upper hand because they are of a background that allows them to get enrolled in schools because of their color. But in a sense, they're just trying to make excuses, in a sense, to allow for there to be that still inequality, because they don't want to have equality between both of them, because they see it as better as in a sense separate, because they believe one group of people should have the education versus another group shouldn't get that upper hand. But there is no upper hand. They're given a bad hand and they aren't given the same opportunities.
as history has shown already, the issue will perpetuate even with attempts to address it. So there have been attempts to address this problem of segregation and low income generated poor housing, and even with attempts to address it, it has perpetuated. So what can we do?
Well, one of the first ways to enact change is to look back in history at large protests, specifically for the Brown v. Board of Education decision. This was handed out in 1954 with the desegregation of schools, but specifically in Virginia, that some school districts protested this integration, and actually 9 schools closed by 1959 rather than integrate with other races into the school. Here depicted is the march to integrate schools in 1959, and a similar statement can be made today to help level the playing field and recognize the institutions that are in place that are putting African Americans at a disadvantage.
And the issue with this actually is that my father, he was born in 1949, and it wasn't until his 5th grade year that they desegregated schools. So that's around 11 or 12, which would be past 1954 when they passed the actual Brown v. Board.
Another way to address the issue beyond the macro protests and social movements would be appealing to institutions. In the city of Pass Christian, the Catholic Church decided, well, people appealed to the Catholic Church, and they decided that they would send out a message to their schools, and that message was, you have 2 options: either be excommunicated or desegregate by Friday. And there was massive success in desegregating the schools in Pass Christian as a result of appealing to these institutions who have power and who have an ability to directly address the issue. In this case specifically, it's a smaller town, so there were less schools that were affected. Therefore, on a large scale, it might not work as effectively, but small change is still change nonetheless. And finally, a very simple one is vote. In this country, we have the ability to vote and to elect people who will represent our interests and who have a voice in government and will be able to address the systems that are oppressing certain populations of people more effectively than the average citizen is. And there's also a statistic that says that minority populations in general have a lower voter turnout and have less people who do vote. Therefore, there's less of a voice for these populations who are bigger than what their influence in government would suggest. And so by going out and voting, there might be this change as representatives who will address this issue more heavily, try certain things,